There comes a moment in every life when you stop and wonder, what happened to promises you once made? This is a story of Edward Hayes, a man who gave everything to survive and almost forgot the dream that once gave his life meaning. But sometimes, even in the final chapters of our lives, the heart remembers. The wind that afternoon carried the scent of wildflowers and fresh-cut grass. It was one of those golden summer days when the world seemed too young to know sorrow. Edward Hayes was just 17 then, a boy with dreams bigger than the fields that stretched beyond his small hometown. He stood at the edge of Miller's Creek, a sketchbook in one hand, charcoal in the other, capturing the ripples of sunlight dancing on the water. His best friend, Sarah Bennett, sat nearby under the old oak tree, tossing pebbles into the stream and humming a tune her mother used to sing. "Someday," Edward said, his voice calm but filled with longing, "I'll paint places like this, maybe even sell them in a city gallery." Sarah laughed softly, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "You'll forget this place if you ever go," she teased. "People who chase dreams usually do." He looked up from his sketchbook and smiled. "Not me. I'll never forget where I came from." Sarah tilted her head, her expression growing thoughtful. "Then promise me something, Eddie. Promise me you'll always keep your wonder, even when life get hard." Edward paused, feeling the weight of her words even then. The sun glowed through the branches above them, painting the leaves gold. "I promise," he said quietly. "No matter where life takes me, I'll never let it steal my heart." She smiled, that kind of gentle smile that stayed with a person for years. Together they carved their initials into the bark of that oak tree, sealing their promise beneath the summer sky. For a long moment they just sat there, two dreamers at the edge of adulthood, believing that life would always be this simple, this beautiful. The years that followed came faster than either of them expected. Edward's father fell ill the next winter, and suddenly childish dreams had to make way for grown-up burdens. The Hayes family owned a small piece of land just outside town, enough to grow corn and wheat, enough to survive if everyone worked hard. Edward became the man of the house before he even turned 19. The mornings grew longer. The sketches in his notebook grew fewer. The smell of paint was replaced by the earthy scent of soil and sweat. Still, sometimes when he passed the old oak tree, he'd pause for a moment. He'd trace the faint outline of their initials, now half hidden beneath the bark, and whisper, "I haven't forgotten." But as seasons changed, the promise began to fade, not broken, just buried beneath the noise of life. One autumn evening, as Edward carried sacks of grain back from the fields, he saw Sarah again. She was standing near the church, dressed in a pale blue coat, holding a notebook against her chest. "Eddie Hayes," she called out, smiling as if time hadn't touched them. "Do you still draw sunsets?" He laughed, wiping the dust from his hands. "Only in my head. Haven't had much time lately." "That's a shame," she said softly. "The world needs people who remember beauty." They talked for a while about small things, the harvest, the town fair, her plans to move to the city. When she said goodbye, she looked at him for a long moment. "Don't forget the promise," she whispered. "I won't," he said, though even as the words left his lips, something inside him knew how easily life could make a liar out of a man. That night, he lay awake listening to the creak of the windmill and the distant cry of an owl. He thought about Sarah's eyes, the oak tree, the golden light that used to fill his heart. He wanted to believe he could hold on to that part of himself, the dreamer, the artist, the boy who saw beauty in everything. But the weight of responsibility had already begun to press against his chest like a stone. Still, in that quiet darkness, he whispered again, "I won't forget." Years later, the fields behind his family's house became his world. He grew into a man known for his strength, his honesty, and the quiet determination in his eyes. People respected Edward Hayes. They admired how he worked from dawn to dusk, how he never complained, how he always put his family first. But few knew that every once in a while, when the sun dipped low and the sky turned to fire, he'd stop for just a second, shovel in hand, and glance toward the horizon. He'd see the outline of that oak tree in the distance. And for the briefest moment, he could almost hear Sarah's voice again, carried on the evening breeze. "Promise me you'll always keep your wonder." The words echoed like a ghost in his memory. He'd smile, faintly whisper, "I'm trying," and then go back to work. But time is a patient thief. It doesn't steal all at once. It takes little by little, moment by moment, until one day you realize what you've lost. Edward didn't notice it happening. How the boy inside him grew quieter each year. How the dreams that once lit his soul became stories he told his children, then faded into silence. And yet, somewhere deep inside, beneath years of dust and labor, that promise still waited. Like a candle, flickering but not gone. It would take decades and one letter to finally bring it back to life. Winter arrived quietly that year, carrying a sharp wind that bit at Edward Hayes' cheeks as he trudged through the snow-covered fields. The farm, once a playground of boyhood dreams and laughter, now fell heavier. Not because of the cold, but because of the weight pressing on Edward's shoulders. His father had fallen ill, and suddenly the boy who once sketched sunsets and whispered promises under the oak tree was expected to become the man of the house. Every morning, Edward woke before the sun. The air smelled of frost and damp earth, each breath visible in the crisp dawn. His mother, Martha, would hand him a steaming mug of coffee, and the warmth would rush through his fingers, a small comfort against the long day ahead. "Don't forget to take it easy, Edward," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "You can't carry everything on your own." He smiled faintly. "I'll manage, Ma. I have to." And he did. The days blurred together. He rose, fed the chickens, shoveled snow from the barn, and checked on the cattle. Then came the fields, endless rows of corn, wheat, and vegetables that demanded sweat and care. His hands became calloused, skin rough and cracked from labor. The sketches in his notebook gathered dust. The paints dried in their tins. Time for dreaming had vanished, replaced by the rhythm of survival. Yet even in the busiest days, Edward carried a quiet fear, not of failing himself, but of failing his family. Hunger was a shadow that never left the farmhouse. Bills stacked up, storms destroyed crops, and every unexpected illness reminded him how fragile life could be. One afternoon, as he hauled a heavy sack of grain across the frozen field, he paused to catch his breath. He looked at the horizon, where the sun struggled to break through thick gray clouds. The light touched the frost like silver, and for a fleeting moment, Edward remembered the boy he once was. Carefree, daring, and full of hope. He closed his eyes. The oak tree, Sarah's smile, the promise he made to live with wonder. A pang of guilt stabbed his chest. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the wind. "I didn't forget. I had to survive." The wind answered with a soft rustle, carrying a whisper of leaves and distant laughter. But no comfort came. Not yet. Evenings were quieter. After long hours in the fields, Edward would come home, shoulders aching, back sore, hands stained with earth. His younger siblings would gather around the stove, and he would help Martha with supper, setting bowls of steaming stew on the table. He watched their smiles, their small chatter, their trust in him to keep the house running, and he felt pride, yes, but also a loneliness that sat heavy in his chest. One night, as snow fell silently against the window panes, Edward's father wheezed in his chair by the fire. Edward sat beside him, rubbing his father's hands, marveling at how the man had once been so strong, so unyielding, and how now even a simple breath seemed to demand courage. "You'll make it, son," his father rasped, eyes gleaming. "I see strength in you I never had." Edward wanted to laugh, wanted to tell him that it was fear, not strength, that had kept him going. But he only nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. Words felt useless against the gravity of responsibility. Weeks turned into months. The snow melted, revealing muddy fields and weary crops. Edward worked from dawn until dusk, and still the worry lingered. If he failed, the family would starve. Even small failures felt like betrayals. At times, he caught himself daydreaming. He imagined painting the fields, the sunlight spilling over golden wheat, or capturing Sarah's laugh on paper. But the daydreams were always interrupted by the sound of the barn door creaking or the low moan of a cow in need. Dreams had become a luxury he could not afford. Yet, even in exhaustion, he found small moments of beauty. The sun rising over frost-tipped corn, the laughter of a sibling at the table, the warmth of his mother's hand on his shoulder. These little things reminded him why the struggle mattered. They were the threads of life he could cling to, the proof that survival alone was not enough. Love had to endure too. It was during one particularly long afternoon, hauling a sack heavier than any he had carried before, that Edward stopped and looked at his hands. Callous, cracked, veins standing out like a map of years spent in toil. He traced the lines of finger, as if searching for the boy who once held a sketchbook instead of shovel. "I'm working for you for them," he murmured. "But who am I working for me?" For the first time in years, a quiet doubt crept in. The promise under the oak tree, the vow to live with wonder, felt distant, almost forgotten. Edward shook his head and forced a breath. He could not afford to dwell on regrets now. There was still work to be done, still food to put on the table, still a family counting on him. And yet, beneath the exhaustion and responsibility, a small spark remained, fragile but unextinguished. The boy who once dreamed of painting sunsets and capturing beauty in every moment was still there, waiting for the right time to reappear. That evening, Edward sat on the frozen porch steps, staring at the sky melting into gold and purple. The wind carried the smell of thawing earth, of winter turning toward spring. He thought about the years ahead, about the fields that would need tending, the family he would need to protect. But for a single heartbeat, he allowed himself to remember the oak tree, Sarah's smile, the promise he made to live fully, to never let the world harden his heart. "I haven't forgotten," he whispered to the wind again, though he felt the burden pressing heavier than ever. "I'll find my way back someday." The sun dipped behind the horizon, painting the fields in soft, forgiving light, and Edward, though tired beyond measure, felt a strange sense of resolve stir inside him, a quiet determination that survival alone would not define him. Because even under the weight of responsibility, even when life demanded all he had, the promise was still alive. The seasons passed, one after another, each marked by the quiet rhythm of work, duty, and routine. Spring melted into summer, summer into fall, and fall into winter again. Edward Hayes had grown older, his hair streaked with silver, his back bent slightly from decades of labor. The boy who once dreamed of painting sunsets now moved through life with steady, unthinking steps, tending the fields, mending fences, and feeding the animals. Marriage had come, as if it were always meant to, and with it, children who needed care and guidance. His wife, Margaret, was a constant presence, patient, loving, and sometimes gently disappointed that the spark she remembered in Edward's eyes had dimmed. She never scolded him, never demanded anything beyond his presence, but Edward could feel her sadness in the quiet moments, when she lingered in the kitchen after he'd gone to bed, or when she watched the children play and wished he would play with them too. The house was warm but heavy with silence. The ticking clock measured the passing of days with relentless precision, reminding Edward that time was slipping slowly beneath his fingers. His children grew, learned, and began to seek their own lives beyond the farm. And with each small independence, the house felt emptier, echoing with memories of laughter long past. Edward often found himself staring out the window at the field stretching beyond the fence, the sunlight turning the weak gold. He would trace shapes in the clouds, recall the oak tree, Sarah's smile, the promise he made under that old branch. But the recollections were distant, like looking at a photograph through foggy glass. The promise still existed, buried under years of responsibility, work, and quiet sacrifice. Days were long and nights longer. Edward's hands were rough and cracked, evidence of years of toil. His knees ached from bending over soil, planting, and harvesting. Yet, despite the physical exhaustion, he carried an invisible burden that weighed heavier than any sack of grain. The awareness that life had passed by while he had labored. On quiet evenings, when the children were tucked in and Margaret rested in her chair, Edward would sit on the porch, gazing at the horizon. The fields glimmered under the fading sun, and the air smelled of earth, grass, and the faint smoke of the chimney. These moments, fleeting as they were, allowed him a brief respite, a chance to remember the boy who had once chased dreams, the boy who had whispered promises into the wind. He would murmur quietly to himself, "I've been so busy surviving. I almost forgot to live." The words felt heavy, yet true. Even amidst routine, small glimpses of life's beauty reminded Edward of what he had once loved. The laughter of his children as they played in the yard, The smell of Margaret's bread baking in the oven, the golden light filtering through the windows at dusk. These were tiny, fragile threads of joy, enough to remind him that life was not entirely lost toil. But the promise, the vivid, living dream of youth, remained just out of reach. Edward realized he had been running, not from danger, but from the emptiness he feared would come if he stopped. Survival became a habit, an unquestioned routine. And yet, beneath it all, the spark of who he once was remained stubbornly alive, though flickering dimly. One afternoon, as Edward repaired a fence line along the edge of property, he caught sight of a young boy walking along the road, carrying a bundle of notebooks and pencils. The boy paused, looked up at Edward, and called out shyly, "Sir, could you help me? I'm trying to sell these to save for school supplies." Edward stopped, his hammer in hand. Something in the boy's earnest eyes reminded him of himself, of the boy who once believed the world held endless possibility, of the promise that had been made under the oak tree so long ago. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a few coins, and handed them to the boy. "Keep going," he said quietly. "Dreams are worth it." The boy's face lit up, and Edward felt a small warmth, a reminder that hope and promise were not completely lost. He returned to his work in the field, but now his movements carried a faint sense of purpose, as if the day's labor could be something more than just survival. Evenings continued to be quiet, but the weight Edward carried began to shift. The routine remained, but now it was colored with reflection. He thought often about Sarah, the oak tree, and the promise he had made to live fully, with wonder. The words that had once been playful and light now carried weight. Never let life steal your heart. Edward knew the years ahead would not undo the decades already spent, but he also realized that it was never too late to rediscover the boy within him, to remember the dreams, and perhaps to act on them once more. For the first time in years, Edward allowed himself to imagine what it might feel like to paint again, to see the world not only as work, but as art. The spark of that youthful dream, quiet yet persistent, began to burn again, small but bright, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the golden fields, Edward whispered to himself once more, "I haven't forgotten. I'll find my way back someday." It was a gray, rainy afternoon when the letter arrived, slipping quietly through the mail slot and landing on the worn wooden floor of Edward Hayes's porch. He bent down, brushing the raindrops off the envelope at the back of his sleeve, and froze for a moment. The handwriting, looping, elegant, familiar, made his heart catch. Sarah Bennett. He hadn't heard from her in years, not since she left town to chase her dreams in the city, leaving behind their oak tree, their shared laughter, and the promise that had once bound them. Edward's fingers trembled as he tore open the envelope. The paper damp from the rain. The letter smelled faintly of lavender, a scent that instantly carried him back to their youth, the sun-drenched fields, and the golden light beneath the old oak tree. He cleared his throat and began to read. "Edward, if you're reading this, then life has carried me far from you, just as it has carried us both down separate paths. I am old now, and I do not know how many days remain for me, but I could not leave this world without reminding you of the promise we made. Do not let life steal your wonder. Do not let survival rob you of joy. I know you have labored and sacrificed more than anyone could ask, but the boy who dreamed under the oak tree still lives inside you. I can feel it. Remember him, find him again, and live fully, even if it is just for a little while. Yours always, Sarah." Edward's hands shook as he lowered the letter. He blinked rapidly, trying to hold back the sudden swell of tears. The rain fell harder now, drumming on the porch roof like a quiet symphony of urgency. For a long moment, he just sat there, staring at the envelope, letting the words sink in. The boy who dreamed under the oak tree still lives inside you. The memories came rushing back, vivid, alive, and bittersweet. He saw the sunlight through the oak leaves, heard Sarah's laughter echo across the fields, felt the joy of youth unburdened by duty or responsibility. And suddenly, the weight of decades of labor, worry, and sacrifice pressed down on him, not as something to be endured, but as a reminder of how much he had buried himself. Edward rose and walked to the window, watching the rain puddle against the earth. He thought of his wife, Margaret, still working quietly in the kitchen, of his children grown and busy with their own lives. He realized that in giving everything to others, he had given little to himself. The letter was a spark, fragile but persistent. It reminded him that life had not yet ended, that the boy he once was could still be found, and that it was not too late to honor the promise made all those years ago. That evening, Edward cleared the kitchen table and spread the letter before him, reading it again and again. Each word was a thread, stitching him back to the past, binding the boy and the man together. He thought of the oak tree, the carving of their initials, the golden afternoons filled with dreams and laughter. He knew what he had to do. The boy within him was not lost, only asleep, waiting for him to awaken. And Sarah's letter had done exactly that. The rain finally stopped, leaving the world washed and bright. Edward stepped outside, letting the cool, clean air fill his lungs. He walked slowly toward the fields, the soil soft beneath his boots, and for the first time in years, he felt a stirring of excitement, like the whisper of a forgotten song. "This is the beginning," he said aloud, almost to himself. The beginning of finding him again. That night he could not sleep. Thoughts of his youth, the promise, and the years lost danced in his mind like flickering candlelight. He imagined picking up a brush again, painting the sunsets over the fields, feeling the wind on his face, and laughing freely without worry. He realized that it would not be easy. Years of routine and responsibility had built walls around him, habits, fears, and doubts that would take courage to break. But courage was nothing new to Edward. He had faced storms, hunger, and hardship before. Now he would face the storm of himself. And in the quiet of the night, a sense of peace settled over him. For the first time in decades, he understood something fundamental. Life had offered him a second chance, a reminder that it was never too late to honor the boy he once was, the promise he had made, and the wonder he had nearly forgotten. The morning sun rose slowly over the horizon, casting long, golden rays across the fields. Edward Hayes stood at the edge of his porch, the letter from Sarah clutched in his hand. A soft breeze carried the scent of wet earth and new beginnings. For the first time in decades, he felt a pull not from duty or responsibility, but from something deeper, a longing to reconnect with the boy he had almost forgotten. He packed a small satchel, a notebook, a few pencils, and a thermos of coffee. Margaret noticed his restlessness, the glint of determination in his eyes. "Where are you going?" she asked gently. Edward smiled, a little wistful, a little shy. "I need to see the places that made me who I am. I need to remember." Margaret didn't argue. She knew this journey was not about distance, but about reclaiming a part of him he had left behind. Edward's first stop was the old oak tree, standing proudly at the edge of the hill where he and Sarah had once carved their initials. Time had worn the bark, and the initials were faint now, half erased by years and weather, yet the memory remained vivid in his mind. He placed a hand on the trunk, feeling the rough texture beneath his fingers, and for a moment he could almost hear Sarah's laughter echoing through the branches. He sat beneath the tree and opened his notebook, sketching the landscape before him. His lines were shaky at first, hesitant, as if the boy within him needed time to remember how to exist in this world again. But slowly, the sketches gained confidence, and a spark of joy, long dormant, returned. "I haven't forgotten," he whispered to the oak, to the wind, to himself. "I promise I won't forget again." Next, Edward visited the river where he and Sarah had spent long summer afternoons, skipping stones and talking about the future. The water flowed as it always had, silver and glimmering, carrying memories along with its current. He dipped his hand into the cool water, feeling the chill waken his senses, and he remembered the laughter, the whispers of dreams, the boundless hope that had once defined him. It was there, beside the flowing river, that Edward realized how much he had missed. Life had taught him responsibility, resilience, and endurance, but it had also taught him something harsher. How easy it is to lose oneself while trying to protect others. He shook his head slowly. "I can't let that happen again," he said. "Not if I can help it." The journey took him further still. To the schoolhouse where he had first learned to draw, to the barn where he had painted makeshift canvases as a boy, and to the hill overlooking the town, where the sun set in fiery bursts of orange and gold. Everywhere he went, memories returned like old friends, each one reminding him of who he had been and who he could still become. Along the way, Edward encountered people from his past. Neighbors who remembered him as a boy full of curiosity, an old teacher who marveled at how time had shaped him, and even Sarah's brother, who spoke with quiet admiration about her love of art and her faith in Edward's talent. Each encounter stitched him back together, thread by thread, memory by memory. Evening fell, and Edward sat atop the hill, watching the sun melt into the horizon. The colors were richer than any he had imagined, more vivid than any sketch could capture. He thought of Sarah's words again. Do not let life steal your wonder. The boy he had been, the one who believed in sunsets and laughter and endless possibilities, stirred awake inside him, and with that awakening came a sense of purpose, a promise renewed. He would not allow the years of toil and sacrifice to erase the dreams that had once defined him. Edward took out his notebook and began to draw again, the lines flowing naturally, almost as if no time had passed at all. Each stroke was a reclamation, a declaration that he would live fully, even in the quiet years that remained. That night, he returned home with a lightness in his step he hadn't felt in decades. Margaret noticed it immediately, a warmth in his eyes, a soft smile that spoke of rediscovery. You look different, she said softly, curiosity and love mingling in her tone. Edward nodded, placing the letter back in his pocket. I remembered something important today. Something I almost lost forever. I'm going to hold on to it this time. And as he looked out the fields, bathed in moonlight, he felt the boy and the man within him standing side by side, not in conflict, but in harmony. The journey back had begun, and with it, a new chapter of life, one where responsibility and wonder could coexist, where the promise he almost forgot could finally guide his steps. The morning air smelled of earth and dew, and the sun stretched lazily over the horizon, turning the fields into rivers of gold. Edward Hayes stood at the edge of his family farm, a small wooden easel in front of him, a fresh canvas balanced carefully, and brushes held lightly in his callous hands. The journey back had stirred something within him. The boy who once dreamed under the oak tree now nudged the man forward, gently reminding him of the promise he had almost forgotten. He dipped the brush into the paint, hesitated for a heartbeat, then let it glide across the canvas. The strokes were hesitant at first, unpracticed, but soon they flowed with confidence, each one carrying years of longing, sacrifice, and rediscovered joy. The field before him, alive with morning light and the soft sway of wheat, became more than a subject. It became a mirror of his soul. Margaret watched from the porch, her hands folded in quiet awe. She had seen Edward work tirelessly all his life, but this was different. The same hands that had planted and harvested, built and repaired, now danced across the canvas with an energy she hadn't seen in decades. You found him again, haven't you? She whispered to herself, tears prickling her eyes. Edward didn't answer. He didn't need to. The brush spoke for him. The paint sang of sunsets, laughter, and dreams held tight despite years of struggle. Each color was a memory, each stroke a step toward reclaiming the life he had almost let slip away. The children, now grown, came to see him. Their laughter broke the quiet of the morning as they peered over his shoulder, marveling at the vibrant world he was bringing to life on the canvas. Dad, I didn't know you could do this, one of them said, eyes wide with amazement. Edward smiled, a warmth spreading through him he hadn't felt in years. Neither did I, he admitted softly. But I remembered something important, that it's never too late to find joy, even in the middle of everything else. For the first time, he realized that his work, his sacrifices, his long hours in the field had not erased him. They had shaped him, strengthened him, and now they could coexist with the boy who dreamed under the oak tree. Days turned into weeks. Edward painted whenever the sun rose, capturing the fields, the farmhouse, and the subtle dances of light across the hills. His family watched him, sometimes quietly, sometimes helping in small ways, holding brushes, mixing paints, or simply sitting beside him in silence, learning that the joy of creation could be shared. Edward began to tell stories with his paintings, of sunsets he had almost missed, of laughter that had faded, of moments when life had felt unbearable yet precious. Each canvas was more than a picture. It was a testament to promise he had made, a reminder that even the years lost to responsibility could lead to rediscovery. One evening, as the sky burned with the colors of sunset, Edward put down his brush and stepped back. The painting captured the very essence of the fields he had worked in all his life, but also captured something deeper: hope, resilience, and the unbroken promise of the boy he had been. Margaret came to stand beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You found him," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. Edward nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Yes," he whispered, "and I won't let him go again." For the first time in years, the farm felt lighter, the air warmer, the days brighter. Edward understood something vital: that joy, dreams, and responsibility were not enemies. They could coexist, nourished by love, memory, and the courage to reclaim what had been lost. At night, after the children had gone to their own homes and Margaret had gone to bed, Edward sat on the porch, gazing at the fields glowing under the silver moonlight. He remembered Sarah's letter, the oak tree, and the promise that had begun this journey. "I've kept it," he whispered into the night. "I've finally kept the promise." And as he looked across the fields, he could feel the boy and the man standing together, side by side, at peace and finally whole. The day had a soft golden glow, as if the sun itself was lingering a little longer to watch Edward Hayes complete the journey of a lifetime. The field stretched out before him, alive with the gentle sway of wheat and the distant hum of cicadas. The air was warm, carrying the scent of earth, grass, and the faint perfume of late summer flowers. Edward stood quietly at the edge of the field, the brush he had held for months resting lightly in his hand. His paintings were stacked neatly beside him, each one a chapter of his life, a record of dreams reclaimed, moments remembered, and promises kept. He felt the lines on his face, the silver in his hair, the ache in his bones, but none of it mattered. For the first time in decades, he felt complete. Margaret joined him on the porch, her hand finding his. "It's beautiful, Edward," she said softly. "Everything you've done, all of it. It's more than I could have ever imagined." Edward smiled, his eyes reflecting the gold of the sun as it began to descend. "It's not just for me," he said. "It's for everyone I've loved, for every moment I almost let slip away. It's proof that even lost years can teach you the most important lessons." He walked slowly toward the oak tree on the hill, the place where it all began. The initials carved decades ago were faint, weathered by time, yet they still held the promise, the vow of wonder, of hope, of living fully. Edward rested his hand on the trunk and closed his eyes. He could almost hear Sarah's voice, soft and clear, carried by the evening breeze. "Never let life steal your wonder." "I haven't," he whispered. "Not anymore." The children gathered around him, now grown and carrying their own lives and families. They looked at their father with awe and quiet pride. They had seen the man who worked tirelessly, the man who gave everything to survive, and now they saw the boy who had lived fully, who had reclaimed his dreams. Edward spoke to them then, his voice gentle but filled with meaning. "Life will demand everything from you at times. You'll sacrifice, struggle, and work until your hands ache and your heart feels heavy. But never forget, joy, wonder, and love are worth every ounce of effort. They are the promises that make life worth living." As the sun dipped lower, painting the horizon with fiery streaks of orange, pink, and gold, Edward felt a deep sense of peace settle in his chest. He thought of every day he had worked, every year he had sacrificed, every moment he had almost let slip by without noticing. And yet, he also understood that each struggle, each loss, each quiet evening of reflection had led him here, to this sunset, to this moment of fulfillment. He lifted his eyes to the sky, watching the last light of day spill across the fields, and in that silence he felt the boy and the man within him finally standing together, hand in hand. The promise he had almost forgotten was no longer buried, no longer flickering. It shone bright and steady, like the last rays of sun over a golden field. Edward turned to Margaret, his eyes shining with quiet gratitude. "I kept the promise," he said softly, almost to himself. "I really kept it." She smiled, brushing a stray lock of silver hair from his forehead. "And you've shown us all how to keep ours," she whispered. The wind stirred through the wheat, carried with it memories, laughter, and an enduring echo of a promise made long ago. Edward breathed in the evening air, feeling the weight of decades lift, replaced with serenity he had almost forgotten existed. And there, under the soft glow of the setting sun, he understood the greatest lesson of all, that life's beauty is not in the years we count, but in the love we give, the dreams we nurture, and the wonder we carry to the very end.